and I made myself a cheat sheet pronunciation sheet for tonight because I'm going to need it. So in this chapter, there's a lot of names, and a lot of these names are weird names. So I had to, I forget that like the phonemes or whatever, I had to put those down because it was a little rough. Okay, I'm glad I did because it would have been really bad, and Debbie would have had to correct me with all the names. All right, so let's just jump right into it tonight. So this we're going to be in Daniel chapter 11, and as I started writing this, I realized there's too much in here for 1 week. So chapter 11 is going to take us 2 weeks to go through. So there's 45 verses in this chapter anyway, so it's already a long one. But there's so much detail and there's so much information and stuff coming at you that in order for me to really teach it and show you, the verse itself is pretty self-explanatory. You can read it and make assumptions, but then when you apply the historical application of it and you actually see it kind of come to life, there's so much there. So I had to break it up. So this chapter 11, it contains one of the most specifically fulfilled prophecies of the Bible. And it accurately predicts history over a span of like 375 years. Not to mention, there's also prophecies that have yet to come. And as we've talked about before, people think that the accuracy of this book, especially this chapter by itself, is too perfect. It's impossible for Daniel to predict some of the stuff that he did, is what they say. This chapter is so specific that many critics insist that it had to have been written after the fact. Not even during the time, but after it, so that there's so much stuff that happened, and it's predicted so accurately that there's no way this could have been written beforehand. That's what a lot of people believe. It's so accurate that people believe it can't be prophecy. It can't be. So for those that believe in the supernatural, amazing nature of our God, it's actually a testament to God knowing all things and God being able to truly do the miraculous. This is amazing. So instead of looking at it and going, oh, well, that's impossible, it had to be written later, if you think about it from a spiritual aspect, it's like, man, God is awesome. Because not only does he say, like, hey, this is going to happen, but he says, I mean, we're going to get into it tonight, but it's so many specific, like, perfect things. So because there's so much to cover in this chapter, and like I said, there's 45 verses to go through tonight, I decided to split it into 2 different weeks. So tonight we're going to go through the first 20 verses. So this week's going to be all historical content. This is all history here kind of coming alive. And we're going to read through the prophecy, and then we're going to see how the prophecy applies to the actual historical events that they're attributed to. And then next week, we're going to go over more history, but then you'll see next week there's a shift in focus from historical events to end-time prophecies. So Daniel 11, verses 1 to 35, meticulously outlines the historical conflicts between the Ptolemaic kings of the south and the Seleucid kings of the north. So it's all the north and the south, basically. And we're going to hear a lot about all these names. I got this list of all these names here. And what's amazing about this chapter is, like I said, it's so detailed and so accurate that people believe it had to have been written after the fact. So it was written somewhere around 530 BC, but it accurately describes events from 300 years later. So many modern scholars believe that Daniel 11 was actually written sometime in the mid-2nd century, sometime around 165 BC, something like that, because they just couldn't make sense of it. But in reality, instead of focusing on the difficulty of wrapping our heads around it, instead we see the accuracy of biblical prophecy, which is exciting because we see God's sovereignty over historical events, which is why when we get to the end-time prophecies, we can trust what God's word says. If he's this accurate with ancient prophecy, we can trust him to be accurate with future prophecy. And in a chapter like this one, it's really fitting because we see 35 verses that show the pinpoint accuracy and trustworthiness of God's word and prophecies, and then the chapter ends with a prophecy yet to see. So we can trust that it's going to happen the way God tells us, just like the first 35 verses. And then verses 36 to 45 kind of transitions from history to this description of a future ruler that's interpreted as the Antichrist. And we're going to get into that next week. But beyond talking about him, we're going to look at the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom, which is what we're looking forward to. That's the whole purpose of all this. And again, we're going to get into that next week. But this week, like I said, we're going to split the chapter in half here. And a good place to split it, the reason why I stopped at verse 20, which is a verse into a paragraph, is because these conflicts speak. Once you go into verse 21 to 35, it starts to go into kind of a different era. So in other words, verses 1 to 20 this week, and then verses 21 to 45 next week. So this week's going to be full of details and prophecies about the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid conflicts. And it covers a pretty wide period of time here, but more importantly, the first 20 verses lay the groundwork for the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, who we've talked about a couple times before. But again, we're going to get into him next week. So let's jump right into it tonight, Daniel chapter 11, starting with verse 1. This is kind of looked at as a continuation from chapter 10 into chapter 11. It's the same guy talking here. So it says, "In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be of assistance and protection for him." So a lot of people consider it to be part of chapter 10. And if you remember, there was this angel that was strengthening and encouraging Daniel in that moment, and Daniel described him as one with human appearance. This angel was talking to Daniel, and he said, "Do you understand why I came to you? But I shall now return to my fight against the prince of Persia," the evil demonic spirits there, "and I'm leaving, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come," again, demonic spirit. "However, I will tell you what is recorded in the writing of truth. Yet there is no one who stands firmly with me against these forces except Michael, your prince." So last week we talked about how there's this kind of constant spiritual battle, this spiritual warfare going on. And we talked about the role of the angelic beings in this spiritual warfare. And the angel actually told Daniel, he said, "Sorry, I was a little bit late because I was busy being distracted by the prince of the kingdom of Persia," which was this powerful demonic force. I had to deal with this guy for a minute, so sorry for being late, basically. And then Michael, one of the chief princes, which is a high-ranking angel, came to help him. And the angel reveals that I got to go back and I got to fight against this guy, and then I got another guy that's going to come and I got to fight against him too. So, and he says that Michael supports him. So in the first verse of chapter 11, it's a kind of a continuation of that point. So he's still talking about that. In essence, this verse is saying that the speaker, who's that same angelic being from the previous chapter, supported and strengthened Darius the Mede in his first year as a ruler. And this entire chapter is this angel talking to Daniel. The entire chapter is a quotation from this angel. And this angelic being continues to reveal this really detailed prophecy about future events for Daniel. Past for us, future for Daniel. Look at verse 2. It says, "And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will stir up the entire empire against the realm of Greece." So, this angel told Daniel that there's going to be 3 more kings in Persia until this fourth one arises. And this fourth king is going to be strong, and he's going to be rich, and he's going to stir up the entire empire against the realm of Greece. And this was actually fulfilled by the Persian king Xerxes. So technically there were, if you really want to get kind of nitty-gritty about it, there were 4 kings from the time that Daniel spoke about up until Xerxes. So the way that they justify this is either the angel omitted the current king, King Cyrus, or he ignored King Smerdis of Persia, because he actually ruled less than 1 year, and he was kind of viewed as this imposter to the throne, so he wasn't looked at as a real king. So in terms of legitimate kings, there were 3 kings before this fourth one, King Xerxes, arose. So it makes sense that it was King Xerxes. And he was really wealthy, and he used his wealth to set up this great army. And historically, this prophecy is interpreted as referring to 3 Persian kings that ruled after Cyrus the Great, with the fourth king being King Xerxes the first. who is, again, he's kind of famous and well known for this massive invasion of Greece. He attacked Greece, but he was not successful, but he still had this massive invasion of Greece, which is exactly what verse 2 says. Verses 3 and 4, and a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, because his sovereignty will be removed and given to others besides him. Now, we've talked about this guy before, what this verse is talking about. So this powerful king is going to kind of emerge on this world stage, and he's going to have great authority. In other words, he's going to have massive territory, and he's going to be powerful, and he's going to be virtually unchallenged. It says he'll do as he pleases. But this prophecy also shows something else. It says his kingdom's not going to last forever. It says as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom's going to be broken up and parceled out into the 4 points of the compass. In other words, it's going to be broken into 4 pieces. So his kingdom will be broken and divided after his death. And this prophecy is fulfilled by Alexander the Great, who we've talked about before. So Alexander was the king of Macedon, and he built one of the largest empires that the ancient world had ever seen. And it was mostly through military conquest. We talked about him being real fast because he would fight really fast. He was known for his military conquests, and he was this powerful leader, and he had these large territories that he took over, and he actually conquered a really good portion of Greece and Persia and Egypt and even parts of India. So he was kind of taking over that whole part of the world. He was known as a military genius, and he had great ambition, and you can see that's the way he led. And he did all this at a really young age. And actually, his whole life was relatively short. He died at 32 when he was in Babylon. So interesting side note, there's actually some mystery surrounding his death, and I just thought this was interesting. It's assumed to be illness, but the interesting side note I wanted to add was that even though Alexander the Great conquered all these surrounding areas, when it came to Jerusalem, he didn't destroy Jerusalem. So what's interesting is considering how powerful this guy was with his military and how kind of ruthless he was as a leader, the historian Josephus actually provides this interesting account of this encounter that he had, where he says that there had to have been divine intervention or some sort of special circumstance that actually influenced Alexander to not destroy Jerusalem. So he writes and he describes Alexander the Great as having this dream or this vision while he was in Macedonia. And in this dream, Alexander the Great saw a person dressed in the specific attire of the high priest of Jerusalem. And then the figure in the dream encouraged Alexander to cross over into Asia and assured him that he would lead his army and grant him victory over the Persians. But he said, just kind of pass through this area. And so when Alexander later approached Jerusalem, he saw the high priest dressed in those same garments that he dreamed about, and he recognized him as the person from his dream. So whether or not Alexander literally had this dream or not is kind of, it's loosely recorded in history, but some people believe it, some people don't. But according to Josephus, the reason Alexander treated Jerusalem well and didn't destroy Jerusalem is because he recognized him from this vision, from this dream he had. And he actually went on to treat the high priest with respect, and he treated the city with respect. And it's apparently he actually offered sacrifices in the temple at Jerusalem, and he even gave Jews some certain privileges. So really interesting side note. I've never heard that story before. So anyway, back to the prophecy here. The prophecy stated that Alexander's kingdom would be divided, and we know that actually happened. Alexander did not have a clear successor to take over after he died. He did have some potential heirs that would, but they were ultimately killed in different in power struggles that followed Alexander's death. So he didn't have anybody to be his successor. So eventually, and we've talked about this before, the empire was divided to 4 of Alexander's generals, is who he divided up his kingdom to, and the generals established their own kings or own kingdoms out of that. These new kingdoms, even though they were powerful kingdoms, they didn't have the same level of power or unity as the kingdom as a whole under So, and then we're going to get into that a little bit shortly, but this this focuses on the interactions and conflicts between two of these successor kings. So these two kingdoms were really significant because of how close they were to Israel. There was the north and the south, and the promised land, or the beautiful land, it eventually became this kind of battleground as these two kingdoms fought for control over the region, which you can imagine had a lot of impact on the history of the Jewish people. Verse 5. We're only 4 verses in. Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and rule. His domain will be a great realm indeed. So, before we get further into it, every single verse has like a big historical thing tied to it. Every single one of them. Like, even though this is just a sentence that says, the king of the south is going to grow strong, and one of his princes, you're talking about several things that come true that fit that one verse. So, I mean, I don't have to tell you, you're going to see it throughout the night. So Daniel 11 primarily focuses on these two major powers that came from the division of Alexander's empire. So you're going to see them referred to as the king of the north and the king of the south. So the king of the south refers to the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, and then the king of the north refers to the Seleucid dynasty in Syria, so kind of Egypt and Syria. So the king of the south, it refers to Ptolemy the First Soter, who established the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. And he was a really strong ruler, but this says that one of his princes will gain ascendancy over him and rule. And it's interpreted as a reference to Seleucus Nicator the First. So Seleucus was initially one of Ptolemy's generals, but he eventually became more powerful and established this Seleucid empire to the north. So this verse also says his domain will be a great realm indeed, which is interesting because this is an accurate description of that empire. So you can see how they were divided into these two different empires. So the Seleucid empire became a major power, and it controlled a really large territory. I was looking for maps, and I couldn't find really good maps to kind of describe the kind of area that they had. A lot of them were like the entire chapter encompassed in one map and stuff, and it was hard to kind of put a visual to that. But what I did is there's a chart that I found that actually had all the names of all these rulers that we're going to go through. And after this next verse, I think you'll see it for the first time. But so we're only 5 verses in, and already this is setting the stage for these two powers, these two powers and their struggles with each other. And this is what most of tonight is going to be about. So in one sentence, this verse points to the rise of the Seleucid power, initially being connected to the Ptolemaic kingdom, but eventually it would surpass their strength and their territory. So they kind of created this own kingdom for themselves. Verse 6, and after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to reach an agreement. But she will not keep her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up, along with those who brought her in, and those who fathered her, as well as he who supported her in those times. Kind of a complicated sentence there, but this verse is describing this attempt initially to bring peace and an alliance between these two powers. And unfortunately, it doesn't really seem to work out, and it seems like it was pretty short-lived. It says after some years, they will form this alliance. And because of the way that that's worded, it's understood that there's this kind of period of conflict before this alliance was formed. So after some years, they came together and they formed this alliance. And then when it talks about the daughter of the king of the south coming to the king of the north to reach an agreement, it's talking about a marriage agreement. And it was a really normal thing in ancient times. Royal marriages were used to solidify treaties and political bonds between different kingdoms. They would offer their daughter, and they would come up with an agreement. But it seems that the rest of this verse shows that this alliance and this marriage agreement wouldn't be successful in the long run. So they came together to form this alliance, and they put this marriage agreement together, and it kind of fell apart It says, she will not keep her position of power, nor will he remain with his power. In other words, the power structure that was built between that alliance and with that alliance, somehow it was weakened. Somehow it fell apart. And then the verse ends with, she will be given up along with those who brought her in and the one who followed her as well as he who supported her in those times. So even though that's a really wordy sentence, it's talking about treachery, it's talking about betrayal, and it's talking about basically the failure of this alliance, the failure of this coming together. Now, in historical context, this is referring to the marriage between Berenice, it says Berenice, the daughter of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who was the king of the south, or the king of the Egyptian area, and Antiochus II Theos, the king of the north. So this marriage was supposed to bring peace between these two nations, and instead it brought murder, and it caused more conflict, and once again, showing the accuracy of this prophecy. That one sentence, even though it was a little bit wordy, talked about all of this, offering the daughter to come together to form an alliance, and then it falling apart, and then the strength of that alliance falling apart. Interesting. So the next slide, I think, should be okay, and I know that's small writing. So just in the first 6 verses here, we've already talked about all of the first 2 people up there and what's going on. So that's going to come up a few more times up there. So verse 7. So you can see all those weird names that I have to pronounce. One of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and prevail. So one of the descendants of her line is going to arise in his place, and that's simply just referring to a successor coming from the same lineage as the king of the south. And he'll come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north. So there's going to be some military conflicts there. And he's going to deal with them, which I like the way that's worded. He's going to deal with them and prevail, which means the successor from the lineage of the south is going to be successful in his military conquest against the north. And it's referring to Ptolemy III Euergetes. Man, I even have the phonemes and I can't say it right. So it's referring to this guy that actually succeeded his father, Ptolemy III, and this happened in the 3rd century BC. He did launch this campaign against the north, and he was successful. And long story short, it says that the successor from the South dynasty is going to launch a successful military campaign against the north. And that's exactly what happened. One of the daughter's descendants did arise and came against the army of the north and did, in fact, prevail against them. So again, there's verse 7 there. See that? Euergetes. You say it right the first time? Euergetes. Hey, okay. Anyway, verse 8. And he will also take into captivity to Egypt their gods with their cast metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And he, on his part, will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. So Ptolemy III did, in fact, plunder these territories in the north. And they took valuable things, and they took their religious idols, which was another normal thing in ancient warfare. What they did is they would take your religious stuff because it was a sign of dominance. If this is your God that you worship, I'm going to take your God's stuff and I'm going to show you that I'm more powerful than your God. It was asserting dominance over that area. And again, it was a normal thing in ancient cultures. And it says, he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years, which did in fact happen with Ptolemy III. He didn't continue his military campaigns against the Seleucid Empire. And he actually, it's recorded in history as a time where Ptolemy III returned to Egypt for some years. So it's interesting how these short verses, every sentence is pointing to significant things that are recorded in history that accurately fulfill every word of that sentence. This whole chapter is full of this. We're only on verse 8. Verse 9 and 10. It says, then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but then return to his own land. And his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces. And one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, so that he may again wage war up to his fortress. So the king of the north kind of attempts to retaliate against the king of the south. The Seleucid king invades the Ptolemaic kingdom, but they're forced to retreat back into their own territory. In other words, it's a failed counterattack. And then later, the sons of the Seleucid king eventually assemble a bigger army, and they get it together. So after that failed counterattack, a more powerful invasion is going to show up from the sons, and they're going to overflow and pass through, setting the stage for another bigger conflict. If we try to retaliate and we lose, we're going to get a bigger army. We're going to come back. I'm going to go get my dad, basically, but an army. So once again, we see history being fulfilled here. This is referring to the sons of Seleucus II, Callinicus, and it's specifically referring to Antiochus III, and also known as Antiochus the Great. So not Epiphanes yet, but a different Antiochus. So a failed attempt at retaliation followed up with this buildup of a bigger army and a more successful invasion, and it can actually be attributed to historical events. Again, that's in verses 9 and 10 right there. Verse 11, and the king of the south will be enraged and go out and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be handed over to the former. So obviously the king of the south is not going to be super happy after all of this is going on. So the king of the south will be enraged and go out and fight with the king of the north. It says the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be handed over to the former. In other words, despite the Seleucid king's huge army, the Ptolemaic king is going to still be victorious. And this verse is widely understood to be referring to an actual battle that happened in 217 BC called the Battle of Raphia. And the king of the south, which is Ptolemy IV, Philopator, and the king of the north, which is Antiochus III the Great. So Ptolemy IV had this reputation of kind of being non-confrontational. He wasn't really known for fighting people, but he still wound up leading his forces into a victory against Antiochus III at Raphia. And again, it's highlighting the precision of the prophecy in Daniel, accurately predicting a specific historical battle and its outcome. Like I said, 300, 400 years before it ever even happened. Verse 12, when the multitude is carried away, his heart will be haughty, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. So continuing with the king of the south and the king of the north, this says that his heart will be haughty, meaning that after this victory and scattering of this opposing army, and the multitude is carried away, the king of the south is going to become arrogant, and he's going to become prideful, haughty. He's going to cause tens of thousands to fall, and yet he will not prevail. So even though he's going to cause tens of thousands to fall and he'll be victorious, he's not going to actually be victorious. He's not going to prevail. His victory is going to be short-lived, in other words. And in history, this is referring to the aftermath of that battle that we just talked about, the battle in Raphia. So Ptolemy IV was victorious, but he failed to capitalize on it. He failed to really invest in that. Instead, he decided he was going to be arrogant and prideful. And history tells us that he was. He actually began indulging in a life of luxury, and he stopped really caring about the affairs of the nation and about the kingdom. He didn't care anymore. He just wanted to enjoy his lifestyle. He was really prideful. And his victory led to this period of pride, but not to a strengthening of the kingdom. Typically, if you're going to go on a military conquest, you're going to take over an area, you're going to focus on reinforcing that area and building your empire. Not, I'm going to go in, win this battle, and then I'm going to go party for a little bit. In fact, his neglect of affairs weakened his entire kingdom because he decided to live this life of luxury instead. Verse 13, for the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years, he will press on with a great army and much equipment. So the king of the north, again, is going to raise a greater multitude than the former. It's like they keep going back and forth. In other words, after a period of time, the Seleucid king is going to assemble an even bigger army than he had before. And after an interval of some years, as it says, he's going to press on with a great army and much equipment. This is talking about the Seleucid king's renewed attack and how he's going to be well prepared this time. He's going to have a lot more stuff this time. He's got equipment. He's got more weapons. He's got a bigger army. Now again, applying this to history, this verse is understood to be talking about Antiochus III the Great, his renewed efforts to challenge the Ptolemaic power. So following that battle where he was defeated, Antiochus III spent years rebuilding his army. The other guy was just living a life of luxury while he was preparing for war. That interval of some years is talking about this period where he was preparing for his next campaign while the other guy wasn't. He wasn't concerned with the kingdom, he was concerned with himself. Verses 14 and 15. Now in those times, many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also raise themselves up to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Then the king of the north will come, pile up an assault ramp, and capture a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. So that term assault ramp, basically what they would do, they would build a ramp up to the city wall, and then they would bring kind of a battering ram, and they would start to bust through the wall, basically. It was a way for them to break into the city and really go after the city. And see, it says that they'll pile up this assault ramp and capture a well-fortified city. It doesn't matter if it's fortified. They're going to build up this ramp, and they're going to take a battering ram, and they're going to break down the walls. So in these times, it says, many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will raise themselves up to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. It's talking about this period of both internal and external threats to the Ptolemaic kingdom. It says many will rise up against the king of the south. In other words, there's going to be a bunch of people, a bunch of different divisions in power that are going to rise up against the king of the south. And that includes internal rebellions, and that includes power struggles. But the violent ones among your people will also raise themselves up to fulfill the vision. But it says they're going to fall down. They're not going to be successful. So both the internal and external forces, they're not going to succeed in the long-term goal of attempting to seize power from the king of the south. So once again, looking at history here, it's referring to a time when Ptolemy V was a child. Then there was a lot of internal and external forces that were trying to take advantage of the weak political situation. Verse 15 is describing this successful military campaign by the king of the north. It says the king of the north will come, pile up an assault ramp, and capture a well-fortified city. It's talking about Antiochus III sieging and capturing strategic cities in the Ptolemaic territory, which, again, we know has happened historically. So the forces of the south will not stand their ground. Even their best troops are not going to be able to stand their ground. They're not going to be strong enough to make a stand against them. And it's talking about the weakness and the ineffectiveness of the Ptolemaic defenses against Antiochus III's forces. Again, Antiochus was building up his army. He had a better army, had more equipment. The other guy was just indulging himself, basically. And history tells us that this is talking about battles that Antiochus III actually fought against the armies of Ptolemy V, and how Antiochus III was in fact successful in those battles. Verse 16, but he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. But he will also stay for a time in the beautiful land. Notice the capital letters in beautiful land, with destruction in his hand. So this is talking about unchecked power and unchecked authority of the king of the north now. He's able to kind of act according to his own desires with no opposition. He's a powerful guy. The king of the north will be in the land of Israel, it says, and his presence is going to bring the potential for destruction. It says, with destruction in his hand. Again, referring to Antiochus III the Great, his military success allowed him to gain control over that entire region, including Israel, the beautiful land. And again, notice the capital B and L. It's talking about Israel. Antiochus III was able to do whatever he wanted in that region. He took it over, and nobody was really able to stop him. Verse 17. And he will set his mind on coming with the power of his entire kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. So it's talking about a deliberate and well-planned strategy by the Seleucid king. So the king of the north is going to arrange a marriage between his daughter and the king of the south. But unlike the first arranged marriage that we saw, this marriage was intended to undermine the Ptolemaic king from within. He was going to plant his daughter in there as like a mole or whatever. But his plan was going to fail. So again, history tells us Antiochus III the Great, again, he did in fact arrange for the marriage of his daughter, Cleopatra I, to Ptolemy V Epiphanes, the king of Egypt. And Antiochus III wanted to use that marriage in order to gain influence over Egypt and eventually the kingdom. It was a chess move. But history tells us that Cleopatra I instead chose to be loyal to her new husband and her adopted kingdom instead of her father. So again, you see the fulfillment of Scripture. The sentence simply says she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. History tells us she did not take a stand for her dad, and she was not on her dad's side. Verse 18 says, Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many. But a commander will put a stop to his taunting against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his taunting. Again, it's crazy how one or two sentences can cover so much. So the king of the north once his daughter kind of betrays him, he shifts his attention to the coastlands. And then, so this says, a commander will put a stop to his taunting against him. This commander is going to confront the king of the north and defeat him. Once again, we're going back to Antiochus III. This is talking about some of his naval campaigns that he actually went forward with and his conflicts with the Roman Republic. So after his failed attempt to control Egypt and use his daughter as a pawn, Antiochus III turned his attention to expanding his kingdom and the western side of things, which meant naval battles and taking over coastal cities. This commander is the Roman general, I didn't make it for him, Scipio Asiaticus. Man, I feel like I do you guys a disservice when I can't pronounce their names correctly. Okay, the commander is an actual Roman general. We'll put it that way. And because of the growth of the Roman Republic, they eventually butted heads with Antiochus III. And unfortunately for Antiochus, it led to his defeat in the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC. Again, actually recorded history. And that actually effectively ended Antiochus III's desire to gain power over the western regions at all. He gave up trying to take over the coastal regions. So where it says that he will repay him for his taunting, it's talking about Antiochus III's actions leading to his downfall. He tried to go into Egypt from the inside out. It didn't work, so he said, fine, then I'm going to start taking over stuff along the coast with my navy. That didn't work either. It's my own fault. Verse 19 says, so he'll turn his face to the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and not be found. So after he loses in the west and along the coastal regions, the king of the north is going to retreat back to his own territories, and he's eventually going to die there. And because of the way this is worded, it seems to be a sudden death for him. It's understood to be the period following Antiochus III's defeat by the Romans at the Battle of Magnesia. After that defeat, he withdrew his western campaigns and returned to his own kingdom. And then during that time, he was actually forced to pay this huge settlement to Rome, this huge cash settlement to Rome. But he died during some campaign to raid a temple in this place called Elymais, while he was trying to actually steal funds to pay back Rome. So because he lost to Rome, Rome said, okay, then you got to give us a whole bunch of money. And he said, okay, I'll give you a bunch of money. He didn't have the money, so he was trying to steal the money to pay off Rome. And during that time, while he was in the middle of this campaign, it says he stumbled and he fell and he would not be found. In other words, he had a sudden and unexpected death, which again aligns with historical accounts. After his defeat in Rome, Antiochus III returned home, and then he died while he was trying to raise funds to pay Rome. And then verse 20 says, "Then in his place will arise one who will allow an oppressor to pass through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be broken, though not in anger, nor in battle." So Antiochus' successor, we know that history tells us that he raised or rose taxes. But we also know that his reign is going to be short. It says that his reign would be short, and his death would not be due to a typical military conflict. This verse is generally understood to be talking about Seleucus IV. How do I not have that one on here? Philopator. I'm just going to say Seleucus IV, who is the son of Antiochus III. And his reign was indeed known by his taxes, him raising his taxes, again, to continue to pay that settlement that was imposed by Rome after his father's defeat in the coastal regions. But his death, which was an assassination, aligns with the last part of that verse, says he'll be broken, though not in anger or in battle. So he's a king that would raise taxes and then would die not in battle. He was assassinated. And this verse is where you start to see this transition between the reign of Antiochus III to the rise of his more infamous successor, which we're going to get into next week, which is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So Seleucus IV, his assassination paved the way for Antiochus IV Epiphanes to rise to power, which is the guy that most of next week is going to be about, that we've talked about before, that kind of gives you a historical example of what the Antichrist is going to look like. So needless to say, the rest of this chapter is going to be very interesting. So just to recap here, in the first 20 verses here, Daniel 11 is being spoken to by this angelic being, and it continues straight from chapter 10. And the first 20 verses of this chapter are talking about all these different conflicts between the kings of the north and the kings of the south after the division of Alexander the Great's empire into 4 different smaller empires. And this angel begins referencing the support that he gave to Darius the Mede, and then he starts outlining the succession of these Persian kings, and he foretells about Alexander the Great, this mighty king whose empire was going to be divided after his death to his 4 generals, to the north, south, east, and west. And then we saw verse after verse after verse about conflicts and wars and battles and alliances and betrayal between the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt, the south, and the Seleucid kings of Syria, the north. And next week we're going to continue to the end of this chapter, and we'll read about Antiochus Epiphanes, and then we're going to talk about the future prophecies yet to come. And real quick, we're going to be in Revelation. That's Daniel chapter 11, part 1. There's still the 4 kingdoms, but it's just specifically outlining the north and the south, and apparently it's because of their close proximity to Israel. It's close to Israel. Yeah, they're just not being talked about. Can we pray first real quick? All right. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your word, and thank you so much just for revealing these things to Daniel in such a way that it reveals your awesomeness, God, and your sovereignty over history, God. It's amazing to see that you can spell things out in such a detailed way, God, and then have it come to fruition over 300 years later. And it's a testament to how valuable your word is, God, and how we can trust what you say, and we can really take it home, God, and we can really take it to the bank and trust that what you say is true, and what you say will happen, will happen. God, I'm so excited for what you have in store for us, and I'm so excited to know that we've put our faith in the right place, that we can really trust you, and that when you say that you came to die for our sins, God, so that we may experience eternal life, God, it's true, and that we can trust what you did on the cross is real. So God, I just want to thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for the gift of redemption and salvation, God, that we never deserved, and yet you loved us so mightily in such an amazing way that you always had that as your plan A. Redemptive love. God, it's amazing to see the deeper we get into your word, God, the deeper we get into studying these things, God, we see your love poured out all over human history. And we see you as a loving Father, and not as a tyrant and not as a wrathful God, but as a loving God that offers peace and offers hope and offers a promise of the future. So God, we cling to that, and in all we do, we love you and we trust you. It's in your Son's name. Amen.